Hello, everyone. This is Angela Rosman and Regina Moore with Women's Personal Finance here to have Stephanie O'Connell Rodriguez talk to us about her brand new book, The Ambition Penalty.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It is Wednesday, July 8th. And just as a reminder, when you're watching these, me and Angela are not financial professionals. I don't believe Stephanie is either, but she can make her own disclaimer. So if there is anything specific to finance, tax, etc., that is not personal advice. This is just people who like to talk money topics and get nerdy about it, doing this for entertainment purposes. If this is your first time joining for anything from Women's Personal Finance, we'd love for you to give us a follow. We're at Women SPF, if that's easy to remember on most socials. And if you go there, you can easily link to where to find us or grab our weekly newsletter. We've hosted Stephanie in the past. This is our first time doing a YouTube live. I am with her, so exciting, and we're glad that you get to watch right away. And with that, I think we'll hop in. Stephanie, give us a little intro, and beyond that, make sure to tell us more about the book.
Sure. So, hey, everybody, I'm Stephanie O'Connell. I'm the author of The Ambition Penalty: How Corporate Culture Tells Women to Step Up and Then Pushes Them Down, which I came to writing through my reporting on personal finance. And this idea that if you followed all of the right steps, you would get these outcomes, which is true to an extent. And yet, so often, what I found when people put the best practices into practice, they would not achieve the same outcomes depending on their identity. Specifically, I focus on gender identity, but of course, outcomes differ across racial identity, across sexuality, across so many different kinds of metrics. And what I wanted to dig into was what was happening. Why were people who were doing the exact same things getting different results? And of course, I'm not just talking about, saving money. I'm talking about asking for more. I'm talking about leaning into the workplace and our ambitions and what it takes for us to get the money that we save or invest and then put into practice. And I think that's a really important part of the conversation that gets overlooked. And I wanted to explore more through this work.
So I'm curious, like, we're all kind of sort of the same age, millennial women, and I think when we were like first joining the workforce, like we were heavy into the like boss babe era
Big
that like
time.
um and I'm curious like what was the point where because I think even if we didn't want to, we bought into it at least to some degree that like if we just hustled harder, if we leaned in harder, if we were more ambitious, like things would work out fine. Like, was there a specific point where it started to like feel like that was just like not really what was happening, that narrative felt like garbage?
Oh my gosh, I bought into it too. I just want to say, like, I didn't come to this place of rejecting those ideals of hustle culture and girl bossing and leaning in fully formed. I had to go through the experience myself. I had to research it. I had to interview people. I had to report on it to really pull back these layers. So this is my own evolution, and I think it's also a broader cultural evolution. And what I think about a lot is that I'm turning 40 years old next month. And that means that my entire life and like our whole generational cohort, basically, who's around the same age, grew up on this message of empowerment for women that was really a shift from how we thought about women's empowerment before that time. So I'm born in 1986. Prior to the 80s, women's empowerment was really defined by meaningful changes to power. So we talk about the Equal Credit Opportunity Act that enabled women to access, credit in their own name without a male co-signer, and to be able to, take out a loan on their own without needing male approval or a signer. You talk about anti-discrimination laws, you talk about the civil rights movement, you talk about literally changing policies that endow women with more equitable opportunity. And once those barriers, those kind of legal barriers, to women's empowerment, literal empowerment, financial empowerment started to come down, there was a shift in the rhetoric of empowerment. And it really became about what do you, as an individual woman, need to do inside of yourself to have the same opportunities and outcomes as your male peers. So
Because we've
suddenly,
solved it.
yes, yes. The idea is like now these legal barriers are out of the way. And so the only thing that's standing in women's way now is themselves. And it's this whole message that empowerment is about being confident or being more ambitious. It's this individual and internal project. And that is the kind of messaging we were all raised on. And it felt exciting because when the problem, we wouldn't say it this way at the time, but when the problem is just you, it makes it feel like, well, if the problem is just me, I can overcome it and it's entirely within my control. All I need to do is speak up or lean in or power pose or change my punctuation in my emails or whatever else it is. And I think as we matured through the 90s girl power, through the 2010s girl boss lean in era, women got older. They were in the workforce. They were doing all of these things they were told to do, and yet they were not getting the same outcomes as their more privileged male peers. And they were facing the same inequalities as the generations that preceded them. And so the reckoning with that new vision of empowerment at the time, and the one that's old to us by now because we grew up with it, I think has been something we have all been kind of reckoning with as by necessity, by people who are in middle age and have seen our earnings flatline while our male peers still have their earnings continue to grow and grow and grow, and then to be gaslit with this idea that we weren't ambitious enough or confident enough or asking for it, when for the last several decades, you've had generations of women doing those very things. I think it's just become something that a story we couldn't afford to ignore anymore. And it became untenable to continue gaslighting women with the idea that the solution was internal and individual, when it has now become so clear that those external barriers that we thought were fully removed aren't really removed. They just look different.
Stefanie, I have a question about this from your research. Were you able to ascertain if there's kind of like a point in the career where this becomes more apparent? Like looking at that generational like application for a lot of us who, like accepted that maybe there was this, even if we didn't buy in. I would say I never bought into like the boss babe type stuff, but I did internalize some of those concepts of just assert yourself and, all those. But for those of us who maybe heard those like in our early 20s or right as we were graduating college, is some of that maybe more true for like the early phase of the career, and then it's just a new ceiling?
So, where I really see this dynamic play out is immediately when women begin to enter their workforce. I think there has been a lot of attention around the idea of women's educational outcomes outpacing their male peers. Even entry labor force participation has been very publicized. And there is this idea that these metrics are indicators that these barriers are no longer present. So it's just a matter of time that women's outcomes are going to be the same as their male peers. But what I point out in the book is that women's outpacing men in education and even in entry level workforce participation has been happening now for years. In terms of education, it's been 4 decades that women have been outpacing men in higher ed. And yet here we are, 2025, gender pay gap just grew second year in a row. It's where it was back in 2005, which I said I'm about 40, and that means like the gender pay gap is where it was when I was a freshman in college now. So what I think the data really points to is there is this real fostering and support behind the idea of ambition in girls, in young women who don't have actual power, but there's kind of the potential of power. There's this investment in the idea of empowering people's potential if they are identified as girls. But as soon as they become women who have the actual opportunity to act on their power in workplaces where they might challenge perceptions of male dominated hierarchies of power and authority, that's when the ambition suddenly becomes a liability and starts to be more likely to be punished. And the assertiveness becomes seen as often a bad thing instead of a good thing. And this is really evident in the broken rung phenomenon, which is this phenomenon of from the first step up from entry level to management, you see inequality between men and women jump dramatically. And at every subsequent level, you see those gaps grow and grow and grow and grow over time. So often when we talk about pay gaps, we're often talking about these patterns in which women's career advancement is suppressed, such that you have people who enter into the labor force at relatively equal footing. And even that is because women are overeducated relative to men. So just to access the same initial professional opportunity as their male peers, they have to be even more qualified. And this is especially true for more marginalized women, women of color. And then at every subsequent level thereafter, when we talk about going from potential power to power in practice, that's when you start seeing double standards where the very same ambitions and behaviors that men can reliably implement to get ahead, to get advancement, to get rewards are often weaponized against women and treated as a liability.
It's, I was reading, you had shared something recently about that pay gap growing again in 2025, and I was reading some of the articles on that and talking about how this gap grows like over time. It was very fascinating, not great, but in a way that like makes logical sense that the biggest wage gap is at the highest level of
Correct.
so like as you go up, if you are making like the 90th percentile of incomes, like the gap between women and men, the gap between black women and white men, the gap between Latinx women and white men, like it grows more as you like even if you get up higher, like you may be making more than you expected, but it's still not enough. And I think that's part of it too, is like this feeling of like you should just be grateful that you're in the room. Like that somehow we've gotten to the point where like, but you have this position of power, but you got to this point in your career, in your industry, that should be enough, even
Mm.
though the gap is bigger nearer to the top.
Yeah, aren't you happy? You get to hold the CEO title. How dare you demand that you also be paid equitably for it? It's just so absurd. And I think it also really exposes so many of these myths and misconceptions that are still used to justify these gaps in pay across, again, so many forms of identity. It's not women choose lower paying jobs or aren't interested in leadership positions or spontaneously opt out of their careers. You can control for just about any metric, job title, income level, everywhere you look, you're still going to see these enormous gaps that, as you point out, get worse the more you succeed and the more you advance. And there is an interesting paradox there. I think the latest report, I think it was Glassdoor, that put out this pay gap report looking at the 2025 numbers, showing the gender pay gap doubles over the course of a career. And by a woman's late 30s, which is now, I'm older than that, they're
Yes.
which means that, women's earnings growth essentially flatlines by that point in their lives, while men's earnings growth continues to climb for another decade. And then you have people say, well, that's, when people are in the thick of early motherhood, as though men aren't parents. And it's just like, what are we talking about here? There's such a rote acceptance and repetition of these numbers that I think we do ourselves such a disservice in not saying, excuse me, the differentiating factor here is not parenthood. The differentiating factor here is gender. And that is not acceptable. It is not acceptable that the women who are already carrying most of the household load, most of the caregiving load, often whose incomes are used to pay for majority of household expenses and child cares. And 45% of mothers in the United States are breadwinners for their family. So they are, and when you use a totality metric, they are the providers. It does not make sense for those people to be underpaid.
So I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat, and one person says that they've been examining the executive teams of places like financial companies to see if women are in actual positions of power, other than the areas that are okay, like HR and communications. And I think that's like really fascinating when you start digging into it. It's not like, are they just paid more, but also like, where are they in those executive teams?
100%. I mean, this just played out recently at JP Morgan. They had there's been this like huge succession race to who's going to replace Jamie Dimon, and there were two women who were really considered to be the front runners, and then it dropped down to one, and she was really considered to be the front runner, and then suddenly they announced she's retiring, and these two men are going to take I think operations roles. So and it's funny just because it's this pattern that plays out again and again. Either women get siloed into positions that are not valued by the company, so not having like a profit and loss responsibility, more like an HR role. And that's not to say those aren't valuable positions, but the way in which power is rewarded, and the way in which the hierarchy of corporate life works, it's like profit and loss responsibility winds up being the kind of opportunity that allows you to get to the next level. And yet even women who are actively advocating for those roles are either pushed out into a different, like more human resources culture role, again, incredibly important, but not valued by these companies, or they are pushed to retire. Retire is an interesting word because we know that is not a choice that is being freely made. Those are women who do not have the same choices to make.
One thing I'm thinking of listening to this, Stefanie, is um, maybe for more, middle class or upper middle class women earners who are uh, built up based on potential and who decide to dive in and go full force on education and other things, and the burden that comes with that, with their student loan debt and all those other things, that it's almost like a double whammy way of setting them back a little bit. Like not only are they not making the money of their male peers, but they also have this huge debt load that they take on the promise that they'll be able to do the same things. And kind of an interesting twist on ways that our system and patriarchy can help keep women behind even when making us feel empowered.
100%. And then I think you really bring it into the wealth equation because, so often this becomes conversation about pay or income. But when you consider the added debt load that women have to take on essentially to access the same opportunity, and I would say much more so for women of color, it's to your point, even more of a contributor to these wealth gaps that I think we've also been told are a matter of like, well, it's just an individual choice problem or a savings problem or an investment problem. And again, like I'm not saying there is no role for us to save, to build our wealth, to follow these best practices. But when you have such a different experience of trying to, put these steps into practice or even get the same kind of cash flow to make your wealth system work, then it feels so disingenuous to talk about these things like they're all the same and all our opportunities are equal. And that's why I love, the space that you've created to make sure these conversations are always cognizant of the fact that, we're not just talking about different income opportunities. We're talking about like different debt loads by necessity, different financial obligations. If you're a caretaker or if you're, first gen and supporting your parents too, these are such important things to talk about. And I think like the obsession in not just the United States. I would say like we've kind of exported this obsession with individuality globally, unfortunately, at this point, where it's like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It's all a meritocracy. The only thing that matters is your performance. I think those myths are important to dismantle as much as the myths that, women aren't confident or ambitious.
So, in doing the research for your book, like we're talking about things that I think all of us inherently like feel and understand. Like the data supports what our experiences have been and the experiences of our friends and having these conversations. But like, were there specific data points that were like backwards from what you expected them to be?
Ooh, backwards. I
Or is it all
was ready for
as we
surprising. I don't know if I was ready for backwards.
I mean, surprising is good too, but I'm just curious because I think right now, especially like we're in 2026, we are all like this is not specific to this conversation, but we are all so primed to like things that are like falsely created by AI,
mm,
quotes that are taken out of context, etc. Like, and it's so easy to like reshare and re-talk about things that sound like they match our
yes.
perception of our worldview, even if we don't know if they're accurate. And I know that like sometimes like the objective data doesn't match what we expect it to. And I'm just curious if there was anything like that went, I mean, kind of like we were all told that women just need to ask for
Mm-hmm.
more money and that that's the problem. And like, I think we're getting to the point where people understand that that's not true, that women ask for money as much or more than men. But I'm
Yes.
curious if, maybe expand on that or if there's anything else kind of
Well,
like
there
that.
was there was a follow-up stat to the one you just shared that was interesting to me. Maybe not a reversal of what I believed, but it found that not only was this idea that women don't ask for more not true, that women are simply less likely to get what they ask for, but they found that the more people bought into that belief that women are underpaid because they don't ask, the more likely those people were to increase the very gender stereotyping that gives rise to gender discrimination in the first place, and the less likely they were to support pay equity policies that close gender gaps. So buying into the false belief in and of itself worsens inequality. And that's why I think the myth busting is so important. I will say one of the things that has been really interesting to look at is like yeah, I'm obviously talking about myths and false assumptions, but one of the misperceptions that I think is really not talked about enough is this idea that women are more represented than they are, or that they're doing better than they are. I already spoke to this discourse around the idea that women are out educating their male peers and therefore like inequality is all in the past or it's only a matter of time. As I mentioned, that's really an indicator of women needing more credentials to access the same opportunity. And even then, that hasn't done anything to close pay gaps in 20 years. But also there is an idea that women are taking over, that they're dominating conversations, they're dominating boardrooms, they're dominating television shows, like across every single medium where you hear these conversations that, oh my gosh, it's just like women who are everywhere and like what happened to men. And yet when you look at the data about representation, we're talking about over 80% of corporate management still being dominated by men, and overwhelmingly cis straight white men. And we're talking about women speaking up in meetings. It's something like 30% of the time is perceived as women dominating the conversation, women being represented like at 10%, 20%, 30% of anything. It's already perceived as them being the majority. And that really tells us how far we haven't come. And I think that was something I definitely understood as I started researching this book, that our perceptions of progress were far more advanced than the actual progress was. But what I didn't know is just how disconnected those perceptions were from reality, and then the implications of that misperception. Same with this idea that when people believe women are underpaid because they don't ask, they become less likely to support equity policies. It's the same thing when they believe women are overrepresented, even when they're underrepresented. They become less likely to support policies to ensure that women aren't being discriminated against. And again, like every time I'm saying woman here, you could really substitute any marginalized and underrepresented group, because these are dynamics of like power, and the way power is distributed in the workforce in this country is still really dictated by these incredibly hierarchical, patriarchal, white supremacist norms. And so I think what we can really do is try to always, when we confront one of these ideas or sayings or stereotypes, like take a second look, go look at the numbers, and then is that accurate? And if it's not, like, who does it serve to misrepresent this? Or if it's accurate but it's like trying to tell a different story than it's telling, then who is that serving? And why is this being adopted at scale? And what does that enable? I think there's just a little too much comfort with this idea of progress being inevitable, of we've come so far, we should be grateful, we should be celebrating, because that's really what got us, I would argue, to this moment where we've not only seen stalled progress, but backsliding. It's that kind of complacency and weaponization of perception that gives a permission slip to people to say, oh my gosh, we don't need more women or marginalized folks in these roles. They're already everywhere, because you've already seeded the ground with these false ideas that they're everywhere.
Stefanie, I'm curious about the role of the media in some of this, thinking
Yeah.
about perceptions um and you noting, all the places that people see women now,
Yeah.
that there's, I think, like a paradox there that I haven't thought deeply on this enough to be able to attack, but we have more visibility as well. So we have the promise of possibility, and then those of us who do succeed get high visibility compared maybe to the um, quantity of men doing maybe similar things. And but so it does, one, make it look like more women are out there being represented because they're not showing the men. Do we, do we want to be visible that way or not? I don't know. But it's not just that, but it also puts women out there to be the ones who are examined and critiqued in much more detail. And then male mediocrity can go unwitnessed, but everything that the successful women do tends to be under a bigger microscope. Like
You're absolutely right. Like there is this phenomenon of like hyper visibility, even outside of media, even in a corporate structure. You hear women, particularly women of color who've ascended into positions of leadership, will talk a lot about this, how they feel like they suddenly become like they have to represent their entire marginalized class or become the spokesperson. And then they can't mess up, because then if they mess up, it says something not about the circumstance or them, it says something about the entire group. And then I think when you add in the media layer on top of it, it amplifies all of that. And so there has been this kind of like tokenization effect that we already see happening in these cultures where people are so underrepresented from marginalized groups already. And then when you scale that out to the cultural sphere and the media sphere and all of the coverage, it like turns the dial up and up and up. And then you get, I know we started with like a critique of the lean in era and the girl boss era, but then you get this whole idea that like, oh, it wasn't just an issue of this kind of like hyper individualist neoliberal capital approach to success. It was the idea that women in leadership was always a bad idea. That with the downfall of the girl boss and all of those hyper visible women CEOs and like all these allegedly feminist companies being exposed as just as toxic as their male peers, right? I think that's a really good example of this phenomenon where not only when you're kind of like elevating these people in a hyper visible way, not only are you kind of like creating fostering this misperception of how well represented women collectively are. But then you're kind of setting the stage for a story where, when those women who are already hyper scrutinized, who are already far less supported, who are already subject to more constraints and double standards than their male peers, fall short, then it becomes a kind of indictment on all women's leadership, all women's power, all women's ambition. And so I think now, for the last several years, there's the response to the girl boss culture hasn't just been, oh, well, that this hyper individualism bootstraps narrative isn't great. It's this idea that, well, we should just reject ambition. Women should just reject ambition in public life altogether. And that's a story that is notably incredibly gendered, even as, like, we're talking about some of the most toxic work cultures ever in like modern contexts. So like women
You don't tell
disavowing
the
ambition.
men, yeah, you don't tell the
Exactly.
men to have this soft life and just stay home with their babies and their apple pies.
Even
Like,
though that would
even,
probably more meaningfully change the actual work culture, because then workplaces would have to adapt to people with caregiving responsibilities, because they do respond to men's needs.
So do you feel like any of this can, tie in almost directly into like the rise of kind of the trad wife
Oh yeah,
culture and trope right now? Like, can you give us a
100%.
little narrative on how you see that arc?
Yeah. So when I started writing this book, it really started with this kind of critique of what we spoke about at the beginning, this hyper individualistic, pull yourself up by your bootstraps narrative, and the kind of corporate feminism that we grew up with, particularly in the 2010s era, as I personally started my career. But it wound up ending with, this kind of trad wife fantasy, soft life trend that we're seeing on social media, which wasn't really that big when I started writing the book. There was the rise of quiet quitting. There was kind of like this burnout, like real problems, a response to real problems. Like, yes, hustle culture is unsustainable. Hyper individualism isn't working. Neoliberal capitalism is leaving us all in poorer health, in like exhausted, burnt out, not able to afford anything. So like a real legitimate pain point. But then what I think these trends that kind of popped up as I was writing, and then I end the book exploring, what I think they did is take that real pain and then use it to sell women, and women exclusively, that the problem wasn't these unsustainable systems of work. It was women wanting to be part of having the same rewards from the workplace. I always talk about that, what a lot of these social media visions of trad wiffery or soft life are promising is often not a reduction in women's labor. It's a reduction in their compensation or their access to financial resources or autonomy or security or basic rights. And I also talk about the fact that in many ways, the vision of these anti-ambition trends is actually very similar to the kind of girl boss lean in trends that they're responding to, because they both ultimately tell women that the problem is them. In one vision, the girl boss vision, the problem is that you're not ambitious enough. And in the trad wife vision, it's that you're too ambitious or you're incorrectly ambitious. And you just need to be more feminine per these white supremacist patriarchal standards. And then that will unlock safety and security and freedom that you've really been craving. But at the end of the day, both ideologies are the same hyper individualism, the problem is inside you and not the world around you. And that enables these kinds of systems around women, the ones that actually do change our outcomes if we challenge them, to go unchallenged, to reinforce themselves, to double down on exclusion, no matter how much we're stuck in a cycle of self optimization. And so I wanted to not only draw that through line from the beginning of the book to the end of the book, from girl boss to trad wife, not just because, like, I think we miss how much those two things are connected, but because I think it really tells the story of, the kind of cultural moment we've been going through for the last several decades in a way that I think gets flattened or oversimplified and really misses how much this has become a gendered story, even though we know it's a gendered story. Like, nobody is creating content out there for men to like go bake pies all day, as you said, Angela, right? Like, it's not like they're like making these videos about like, do you want to be soft, just just
Best we
stop
get is
caring
the
so much
hoochie
about your
daddy.
paycheck, right? It's in fact the opposite. This kind of obsession with like hyper consumption, hyper
Yep.
financial gain, kind of doubling down on hustle. And so I think it really exposes the idea that like they know that hustle culture isn't the problem. Well, no, they sorry, they believe that hustle culture isn't the problem. The people kind of promoting this thing, they think the problem is that the
Women are
rewards
in
of
the
it should only be accessible to men. And so I always say, like, if these people were really like trying to dismantle these oppressive systems, if they really cared about challenging these hustle cultures, then this would not be a gendered movement. They would care about work-life balance for men too, but they don't want that. They want a gender division of labor and a gender division of power. And that's why they're not advocating for a stronger social safety net. It's not like, I'm not against like baking content or sewing content or taking care of kids. Like, I got a kid, I cook, all that stuff too. But at the end of the day, the thing that's going to help me do that and you do that and everyone else do that is not how I style my hair or put on clothes. It's like a social safety net and a universal health care. And so I think it's really telling and doesn't get called out enough just how much like what these people are selling is not that lifestyle, but a kind of, this gender division of labor and power.
Some of these conversations that look at arguably like well-intentioned practices initially, with trying to teach women and talk to them about being more ambitious, about how these types of things that try to solve capitalism with more individualism, how they continue to fail. But I do feel like we're reaching a point where there is a lot more talk and awareness about collectivism, and I'm hoping that there's some amount of turning point happening, at least with the more left wing kind of minded people, because I do feel like we are starting to see more narrative around that and more recognition that these things are not working, that they keep trying to tell us we can fix ourselves.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's been really inspiring for me to be living in New York City the last 6 months with our new mayor. My kid is going to go to pre-K this fall. She's 2 years old and it's going to cost $0. And I think it's just really indicative of the fact that we have solutions. We know what works. They are possible. They are happening right now in some places. The biggest barrier to implementing them is this kind of like collective action and will to bring them into being. And I think as we see more kinds of examples of transformational leadership and collective action and like really community policies that really focus on community good, I think that is going to hopefully inspire more of it and more demand for it. I also think it's been really inspiring to see how communities came together, even when there wasn't legislation, even when forces were working against them in Minnesota, when, ICE was out in Minnesota and you had people coming together to do community resource sharing and buying groceries and doing mutual aid and like really understanding that like there's not an individual hack out of this kind of attack. And I think obviously that's such an extreme example, but I think it's an illustrative example of when you work collectively, you just go so much farther. And I'm hoping that as as we're kind of forced to build our resistance muscles and our organizing muscles through the worst of circumstances, we can now hopefully bring that into bettering our communities, even when we're not in a state of crisis.
Well, and kind of thinking along those lines too is, how much that this isn't like new. A lot of
Yes.
these like conversations aren't new. I mean, um, I was absolutely an adult before I realized that we had universal childcare during World War II.
Yes.
Like, we had universal childcare because the men were fighting and the women had to run all of the jobs. And so there was enough of an issue that suddenly we could do universal childcare as a country, and then the war ended, and suddenly that disappeared. And it just feels, in some ways it's like, how do we learn that, like, number one, like, these are not quite unprecedented times, and number two, how do we like actually hold on to that stuff rather than
Mhm.
just, it's there for like a flash and then it goes away again.
Yeah, I mean, and this is where I think it's so important to kind of push back against what I'd argue is basically a collective gaslighting, that these things are not possible and that these are just pie in the sky things. Like, history shows otherwise. We know what works, or that we should kind of devolve into nihilism, that, oh, it's all hopeless. Another thing I've been thinking about a lot is, I talk a lot about systemic change, right? Instead of, I talk about shifting from individual to collective, and from shifting from personal and individual to systemic. And when you talk about that, people think, okay, if it's not me, it's the system. What can I really do about it? I can't change it. And I just want everyone to like take a step back and look at the last 2 years, because everything around us systemically has changed dramatically and quickly. I would argue in ways that are horrible, terrible, but there's this idea that just because something is systemic doesn't mean it can't change. But it does change and can change all of the time when there is the organizing power and the people showing up and people who have laid the groundwork. And that's where I think like the right, it has been unbelievably effective in really organizing and creating a playbook for, I think, creating some of the appetite for some of the worst policies that ever have been. But regardless, it is a model of just how much you can change within a system and operate within a system. And so I want people to think, to not get like nihilistic when we talk about things systemically, but to be aware. And to your point, like, awareness means reading history, knowing what this looks like, knowing what has been so you don't buy in when people tell you it's impossible, understanding how we got there. How did people with a lot less power than we have right now get their access to rights and opportunity? So, yeah, I mean, as much as I am chronically disappointed by the news cycle and depressed by the news cycle, I'm not hopeless. I'm not hopeless at all. I mean, like, we are in a much better position than people who came before us, because we do have a lot more access to resources and knowledge and opportunity. I do think one of the biggest barriers that we are facing is this kind of like collective gaslighting that has really seeped into all of our psyches and our cultural psyche, to be so comfortable with the level of inequality we currently experience.
I'm hanging on to your little statement there. It's kind of a twisted kernel of hope,
A
but
twisted kernel of hope. I should
look
put
at
that on the cover of
everything
the book.
they've been able to accomplish in this very short period. We can do that too.
I mean, really. I mean, but it's just like, it's such, it really shows their hand. Like, these are the people who will tell you that the reason you're poor is you. And then meanwhile, they're the ones like reshaping the entire legal infrastructure of the country, just rolling back people's rights, taking away equal protections, defunding government programs and education departments. And it's like, no, no, no. They know the answer is systemic, and they change the system while they tell us that we're the problem. Like, let's call that out.
The answer, they know the answer is systemic, so they're changing the system.
It really is that easy. Different problems we're addressing, I guess. But yeah, that's you got to change the system. I had one thought listening to this, Stephanie. I know we focus on gender here.
Yes.
How much of this also dove into things like pretty privilege? I'm thinking
Mhm.
of a research article that I heard about yesterday. I didn't read up on it yet, but it was about weight loss drugs like Ozempic, the
Yes.
GLP-1s. And did you see this one in the last day or two?
Yes. The weight
And
bias.
Okay, I
job
did not read this
hunters.
Mhm.
one, so please enlighten me. I
It
don't know
had
if I
to
want to know, but
It had to do with I think they only looked at women, at least that's all I heard it reported on. I'm not sure if men were included, but who were job seeking and did not have jobs, and that those who were on these drugs got jobs at much higher rates. It was like 20 to 40%. Somebody would have to pull it, but significant. But that progress stopped once they got the jobs. That the people who were on weight loss drugs at work, they're not getting promoted faster. So something about hireability along with your external how you look and things like that. It did affect your hireability, but it didn't affect your trajectory once you were hired near as much. Does that sound similar to what you read, Stephanie?
Oh my gosh, absolutely.
Okay.
It's so interesting how even the stereotypes that can in certain instances work in your favor. If you think about pretty privilege, if you think about even like racialized stereotypes, for example, Asian American women are often from certain countries are often experience racial stereotypes that in a workplace setting can be beneficial. There's this idea that Asian women are super, super smart. And so like it can help you get a job. Just like people want to work around pretty women so that can help you get a job. And yet that same stereotype can then work against you within the workplace because people might want to be around you if you're pretty, but if you ever challenge their authority, if you ever challenge the idea that you should be like your prettiness is to serve them and not yourself or to your own benefit. If you ever try to access authority or power or assert yourself in ways that are considered masculine, and pretty girls shouldn't try to be masculine even though that's completely arbitrary, like then you're still going to experience bias and backlash. And for Asian American women, they sometimes face some of the highest ambition penalties because there is this competing stereotype that Asian American women in the United States should be quiet and deferential and serving. So their labor is valued, but only in so much as it supports the ideal of, male power within an organization. And so I think so often when you talk about gender stereotypes, they often intersect with these other aspects of identity that have their own kind of complications where, okay, it can benefit you in this way, but watch out because in this way, it's really going to work against you. And then I think one of my favorite studies kind of looking at how other identities intersect with gender identity is this paper where the researchers looked at why women were kind of excluded from leadership consideration. And what they found was that people wouldn't say, we're not going to promote her because we don't want to promote a woman or have a woman be our leader. Instead, they would weaponize women's other identity characteristics against them through double standards that were not applied to their male peers. So when it came to age, for example, young women were considered too young to be seen as leaders. Older women were seen as too old for leadership. But young men were seen as the next generation of leadership. That's the guy we need to have on our team. He's going to take us into the future. And then older men were seen as seasoned, mature, valuable, experienced leaders that we really need on our team. And so you would have the exact same characteristic for women being perceived as a liability and then be seen as an asset for men. And I think this really comes back to that kind of ambition double bind where you change the pronoun in front of the word ambitious, it changes the connotation, right? He's ambitious is suggesting something praiseworthy, a drive to succeed, just the guy we need on our team. She's ambitious. she's kind of selfish. She's not really a team player. She's not really a good fit here. And I just think what we see in the literature again and again and again is just this host of double standards that fall along so many lines. But gendered lines are particularly interesting. And in that paper where they were looking at, like I mentioned, age, for example, they found 30 different identity characteristics that were weaponized against women through in this way, through double standards that were not applied to their male peers and effectively used to exclude them from leadership consideration. And that included everything from age to race to parental status to physical attractiveness.
Is that paper mentioned in your book, like in the bibliography, or is that something that you can share with us later?
Yeah,
Because
let me
that,
it's Amy Deal.
okay, yes,
I
I recognize her
I've
name.
definitely talked. Yeah, she's great. She's a great follow on
Hmm.
Instagram and Threads. Um, it's if you look up like
We can find it later.
we want
Okay.
what you aren't discrimination is one of the ways she calls it.
Oh,
By
fun.
Amy Deal
Yeah,
and Leanne
great.
Zabinski.
Okay, I'll add it to the description of this video after we're done too. Um,
Perfect.
and then also something that is kind of a flip of what we've been talking about a little bit here, but I do want to, before we wrap up, I want to talk about also the like when you're like the standout in your group, in your field, at your company, etc. Like there's also this like insidious, toxic, like, well, I'm here, so there's no room for anybody else.
Mm-hmm.
And Regina and I have definitely experienced it even in the like money community. I'm sure you have as well.
Mm-hmm.
As long as you're small and new and like less powerful in the space, the women at the top are very like willing to talk to you, lift you up, encourage you, and then as your own platform and power grows, we've seen a number of folks be very much not interested in interacting with us anymore. They will like literally unfollow us. They will stop like it's like as soon as we became large enough to become a threat, we have had a number of women in the money
Mm-hmm.
space be less interested in, collaborating with us. Obviously, that has not been the case with you. We keep, talking again and again, and there are some awesome women where that's not true, but I have seen we've interacted with some of the men that are also larger in the money space, and I have not seen the same, like, either they're going to dismiss us because we're small or dismiss us because we're large, but like women in particular are more likely to feel that threat
Mm-hmm.
as like you become larger, more important, more known, etc.
Yeah, I wanted to dedicating a whole chapter of the book to this phenomenon, the queen bee phenomenon. And it's so interesting. There's so much nuance to it. But I think one thing that's very important for us to talk about whenever we talk about these dynamics of bias is not an individual thing. It's not something I am or you are. It's not me versus you. It's not men versus women. It's not whatever versus whatever. It is the outcome of a culture that basically puts people into these kind of arbitrary groups and says this group should behave this way and this group should behave this way. And if you comply with those expectations, you will be rewarded. And if you violate those expectations, you will be punished. And so that's how you get to a place where men and women do the same thing and have completely different outcomes. That's how you have he's ambitious being seen as a positive, and she's ambitious being seen as a negative. And that's not something that we come to because like we're bad people. It's because we grow up in this incredibly toxic culture that kind of creates these binary expectations across gender identity, which I lay out in the book are incredibly arbitrary. When you come to like real people, everyone is everything, but they are effective in maintaining hierarchies of power. They are effective. This gender stereotypes are used as basically an enforcement mechanism to maintaining men's power while excluding women, so that when everyone is indoctrinated into this idea that men should hold power and be ambitious and aggressive and be rewarded for it, and women should be differential and compassionate and never self-serving, then when a woman violates those expectations, she's going to face backlash, judgment, penalties, stigma, even from other women, because that's the cultural ideal. And so when we talk about these dynamics, I think it's important to understand that they're not individual, they're systemic. That being said, what we know from the research is that these kinds of biases that trigger backlash, particularly against women who express their power, and especially as they gain more success, are most amplified in environments where women have the least power. And that's because in those scenarios, women's advancement is often contingent upon upholding an exclusionary male dominated status quo. So the way to get ahead in a sexist organization is to enforce the same sexism you experience. You want to be part of the old boys club, you better enforce the old boys club. And that's why I really differentiate this book from a lot of other books we've seen on women's career advancement in recent years, where it's like, oh, this is not a book about how you get ahead. This is a book about how women as a social class and all of the diversity that entails gets ahead. And that's an important distinction, because if you're only looking out for yourself, then a lot of your advancement within these kinds of broken cultures is really going to be contingent upon reinforcing and upholding these exclusionary ideals instead of challenging them. But what we do see is that when women's representation in management or leadership comes to a critical mass point, instead of a token woman in leadership or a token woman manager, maybe 2 or 3 women scattered throughout the organization, when they start to be meaningfully represented in the management ranks, we see that that kind of patriarchal culture and incentive structure starts to fall away. And we see that there is more support for women's ambition throughout the organization. There is more championing of women's successes. There is less inequality in evaluations and support and promotions in pay. And so I think it really tells us not about men or women or any individual person respectively, but the kind of incentive structures of a system of exclusion, and how you get to a point where you can challenge those structures is when you have enough people working together in positions of authority, instead of expecting one person or 2 or 3 people who do become represented with or endowed with greater power to be able to change the whole system on their own.
I'll draw this back to us here at WPF before we wrap you up, Stefanie. I think the interesting point to note there, maybe to reflect back to Angela, that I feel like I've noticed is not so much that people are not as interested in us as we grow, but also that I've wondered to the extent that we don't, for our organization, reflect what is typically thought of as women in finance and media. We don't look the same. We don't talk about all of the same things. That it's less about just growth and being women and more about not fitting the acceptable box of what it's like to be successful in that space. So when you're smaller, it's more interesting. You get a little more, people pay attention. But yeah, if you're going to rise through the ranks and continue to not conform, then it does become more threatening. So that's, I've seen it more in that respect. So thank you for validating that a little bit.
Totally. I will also say, personally, I've experienced that phenomenon very much so. And we're obviously in a very changing cultural and media landscape where over the course of the last several years, you can't even say the word woman in federal grant applications. And I think we're seeing the trickle down effects of that through everything, through media, through corporate culture, through opportunity, through who people are willing to work with and champion and support. And I think it's unfortunate, but the incentive structures are making it such that the more shallow you are, the more you're going to be probably supported by those capital interests and those
Mhm.
people in power. And that I think is, a failure again of that kind of broader system, of the broader and such incentive structure, because like at the end of the day, the people who have the money and are funding these organizations, like they don't want to hear us talking about dismantling capitalism. So I think that that hostility has certainly grown more to those of us who are trying to kind of come up with a different model and a different vision. So I empathize with that
Yeah.
too.
So you made it clear, and you did that the book is not a, a self-help,
Right.
type of orientation. What do you hope is the main takeaway that people get from the book, or if there is something that they can take from it that as an individual they can implement, like
Yeah.
what can somebody take out of the book?
One of the things, so in addition to kind of like this cutting through the mass gaslighting, which I think is one of the most underestimated pieces of all of this, just given how much the myths and misconceptions and the kind of repetition of them and not challenging them kind of reproduces inequality. The other thing I really want people to think about is their relationship to these systems of power and how they live their lives every day in relationship to them. When people, again, when I say something systemic, they're like, okay, that's like the federal government. But what I break down in this book is systems are something we interact with absolutely every single day. And I break this down in the book as our interpersonal systems, our interpersonal sphere, our institutional sphere, and then you have our political and cultural sphere. So at the interpersonal level, you have the system of a household. So we often think of this is one of the places I talk about a lot in the book, because we have this tendency, again, to, even if we recognize these issues as systemic, we, when it comes to our relationships, we're like, it's just like personal, it's this special unique little snowflake thing. And it's like, okay, yes, but, or yes, and there is a system of what it means to be a good wife or a good mother in our culture. And that's a system I think we should actively be aware of and challenging every single day, because, my relationship with my child is unique and special and individual. But the relationship I have as a mother in America is shaped by a system of expectations that demands that I be completely self sacrificing, that I am not going to buy into. And I am going to try to challenge not just myself, but in community with other people. And so I think that's the kind of awareness I'm really hoping we can work on cultivating, in terms of like, what am I doing every day to kind of either reinforce these systems of disempowerment or to challenge them. And so that the, interpersonal, institutional, that's like your workplaces, that's where you go to school, that's your community organizations. And then of course the political and cultural, that's not just, again, the federal government, that's your local government, that's your local school board, that's the stuff where, again, I think local politics, local organizing, local communities is where we've seen some of the most exciting momentum in terms of new visions of change. So I just want people to think, really moving from these frameworks away from individual and internal to collective, to systemic, and to thinking about how they operate in ways that can meaningfully change those systems and the environment around them, because I think it's more accessible to us than we sometimes make it out to be.
So this was, I don't know if great is the right term, but I really always appreciate our conversations with you because, it can sometimes feel like we're shouting at a wall. So I think the more that we have data and like clear, like arguments and like clear perspectives for this stuff, it is a lot easier to have those conversations when they come up, when you aren't just trying to argue with the status quo, but like actually being armed with the data and like the deeper argument, I think is really helpful. For folks who want to find you, follow you, your book is pretty much available everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
It's called The Ambition Penalty by Stefanie O'Connell, so pretty easy to search. And then where's the best place for people to find you?
Yeah, I try to stay active on social media, Instagram, Threads at Stefanie O'Connell, and I have a newsletter called Too Ambitious that, Unfortunately, this phenomenon is not going anywhere. So I like to try to speak to the current cultural context. I hope the book provides us like a really good shared vocabulary and foundation and framework, but that we can continue to kind of think about how we're implementing that vocabulary and framework in an effective way to respond to the current cultural climate. That's what I work on in the newsletter.
All right.
Regina,
Thank you,
anything else?
Stephanie. I'm sure we'll talk to you again. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you,
I hope your
everybody.
ongoing book tour, if it's still, are you still touring a little bit?
Working on it. I'll be in DC if anyone's in DC on September 8th, working on some Nashville dates, Philly dates, and Boston dates. But yeah, I got the 2-year-old problem. So
Yeah.
maybe
Understood.
you'll probably meet my child if you come to one of my book events.
Wonderful.
Well, good
Thank
luck
you so much.
on the
I'm going to
tour.
stop the live stream now.